Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. In this short video, I'm going to discuss my workflow for creating terrains, as you see here in this render. Let's get into Blender. Let's get it done. Okay, so here I am in Blender, and this is a pretty straightforward workflow. There's really nothing really magical happening here. So right out of the gate, you can see I've got three elements in the scene here. I've got a camera, I've got this dude for scale, and I've got a plane. Okay, the plane is pretty simple. It's scaled up. I moved some verts around to give it some hills. That's all that's going on here, okay? I'll show you here. Nothing in the modifiers. Everything's pretty straightforward. Okay, so in this workflow, I typically will use 2 to 3 on average different textures to create my terrain. Sometimes I'll use more, like 4, for example. It really depends on what I need the terrain to look like. But in that render that was displayed at the beginning of this video, I used 2, and these are the 2 that I used, okay? These came from polyhaven.com, so they're free textures. You can go grab them, or any of the textures you like. But this is how I make my terrains, okay? First things first, if you don't already have Node Wrangler installed and working, go ahead and do that now. That should be default by now. In fact, I don't know why Blender just doesn't make that default, but go ahead and make that happen. We can see here in my first texture, it's just a standard principled BSDF with my texture plugged in, right? So I've got my base color, roughness, normal, and displacement. That's it. Pretty straightforward. If I jump into my texture preview here, let's take a look at this texture. Okay, so we can see here it's like this gravel, sand kind of thing going on. Now, I want to set the scale, right? So this looks huge. Look at these little rocks, these little pebbles compared to his feet. Huge. So first thing I'm going to do is add Shift-A, add a value node, plug that value node into the scale. This way I can adjust one setting and I can adjust the appropriate axes for the texture. So I know in this case, I'm going to bump this up to about 7. I just know that because that's what I used when I made this art piece. So now if I'm looking at these little tiny rocks and pebbles, this looks reasonable compared to the size of my human, right? Which is real world scale. If I zoom out, all right, we can see tiling, but that's okay. We're not going to worry about that. That's our first texture done. Okay. Now let's jump to the second one. If you've never done this before, all you're going to do is add a second BSDF, okay, second principled BSDF, and then connect your second ground texture to that one. So if I preview just this one, we can see it's this kind of cracked earth rocks thing going on. So just like before, zoom in, take a look at the rocks. They're huge. So I'm going to Shift-A, add a value node and plug it into the scale. And for this one, I know I went a little bit higher. I went up to like 10. Okay. I'm not worried about tiling. What I'm worried about is, do these rocks seem like they're the appropriate size in the real world? Okay. And at about 10, they do. Like these rocks seem reasonable, you know, and the cracks in the earth seem reasonable for my human here. Okay, so there's my second texture. And this one's much more obvious with the tiling. Okay, but again, not going to worry about that. So now I've got my 2 textures, right? Texture 1, texture 2. You can, you know, put frames around these if you like. Now I need to blend these together. And this is where part of the coolness factor happens. Okay, so to blend these 2 together, we bring them a little bit closer. You can do this a couple different ways. If you're using Node Wrangler, Control Shift, I think it's a right click, drag between them, and it'll automatically create a mix shader. Okay. If you don't want to do that, or if you're not using Node Wrangler for some weird, silly reason, just Shift-A and look for a mix shader node, and then bring that into your scene and connect both of your principal BSDFs. Okay. So once you have that, if we take a look here, we can see what's happening. The factor right now is set at 0.5 is effectively just mixing the 2 textures together evenly. So if I set this to 0, we're going to see there's the gravelly sand texture. If I set it to 1, we see there's the rock texture. Okay. Now what this number is set to doesn't really concern me because we're going to plug something into this. Now what we're going to plug into this is entirely up to you. I typically do one of 2 things. I'll either hand paint a texture onto the mesh, right? And then use an image texture as a mask, or in this case, I used a Vertex texture mask. And the reason I did the Vertex mask is because oftentimes if you really get creative with your terrain here and you have like really pronounced hills and valleys, You can apply some procedural vertex coloring, which can be helpful. Okay, it's just kind of a habit. That's just what I used. But either one of those methods will work. So in this case, we're going to use a vertex mask. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to jump back into viewport shading mode and then select my plane here. And I'm going to jump into vertex paint. Now in vertex paint, okay, I'm using the latest version of Blender. So if you don't see these brush icons here, that's why. Okay, it doesn't really matter. You still have access to the same tools. They're just in a different layout. So the first thing I want to do is click on this attribute menu here. Now there's an attribute there by default, but I don't want that. I'm just going to get rid of it just for clarity's sake. I'm going to add my own and I'm going to call it ground. Call it whatever you like. Ground. Okay, so now I've got this ground attribute and it's going to paint the plane black essentially, right? Now what I'm going to do is make sure that I'm in a brush that works. Let's say we'll do a paint soft. All right. And I want to paint this. Let's see. Let's make sure that this is all here. I don't know why these got turned off. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with just painting on white. Okay. So as you can see, as I paint around here, what this is doing is it's using the vertex count or the vertice count of my mesh, right? So let me show you something real quick. If I turn on my wireframe, you can see the density of my plane. Now, this is important because if your plane or object, whatever it is, has fewer verts than this, you won't get this level of detail. You can actually see as I paint here, it's applying paint at each vertice. So the denser the mesh, the smoother this is going to be. Okay, but for this will be fine, at least for now. Okay, if your scene can handle a denser mesh, then by all means make it denser. It's really up to what you're working on. Okay, so let me turn my wireframe off here. So what I'm going to do here now is just, I'm looking at the geometry and I can see where I've got things kind of raised and kind of dipped in, and I'm just going to kind of randomly paint a mask here, right? I'm going to refine this in a minute. I'm just kind of randomly just putting some things down. Okay. Now, before I do anything else, let me show you how to work with this now. Let me jump back into object mode. I'm going to jump back into my textured, my look dev mode here. Now, back in my shader editor, I'm going to Shift A and I'm going to look for an attribute. If I scroll down the list, you can see under input attributes, there's UV map that was created already. And there's the one I created, ground. I'm going to select that. Now there's my attribute, ground. There's essentially, this is my vertex mask right here. I'm going to take the color output, plug it into the factor input, and then look at the texture. You can already see what it's doing. At least I hope you can on the YouTube video. But you can see that now I'm blending those two textures together. Okay? Now, if I look at this from the camera view, okay, it's even harder to see the tiling. But now I could be a little bit more specific. So if I wanted to, I could jump into vertex paint from here, and then I can decide, okay, you know what? I want more of this rock texture up front here. Maybe a little bit back here. Maybe a little bit more over here. Okay, cool. So now I can see, and I hope that you can see it too with this compression, but right up front here near the camera, you can see a very distinct, that rock cracked earth texture, and then it kind of fades into the sand gravel texture, and it's sand gravel here, but then it's rock back here. I'll even add a little bit more rock texture right here. Okay. Now I'm going to jump back into object mode for a second. Go back into vertex paint mode really, and then really back into here. Okay. So this is, you can see what I've added, right? From the camera's perspective, it made these kind of long, kind of V-shaped profile here. And that's fine. I can come in here and just refine this a little bit more, maybe add a little bit more, kind of do this. But this is where it starts getting fun. Okay. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take this blur brush. Okay. It's the same one up here. Make sure that my pressure isn't too high. And I'm just going to start blurring some of these edges a little bit, so they're not so crisp. Right? Just kind of blur through these like so. Okay. Now there's no rhyme or reason to what I'm doing here. This is different every time. I treat it like I hand paint my textures. It's very organic. I try to make it as random as I can. I try to avoid obvious patterns. Okay. Now I'm going to grab this brush here, this smear brush, right? Looks like that. And I'm just going to start kind of randomly smearing these things around like this. I want to make sure that I'm getting a mix of light and dark values. But I want to keep, generally, I want to keep the, kind of the pattern I created. Just kind of mess it up, basically, right? Just kind of go back and forth over. Just make sure I get light and dark values in here. And if I find that it's, it's too light, just switch back to a brush and then switch to black, right? I just hit X on the keyboard, or you can just switch it up here and just paint more black in where you think you may need it, right? Or basically a difference. And it works both ways. You can paint in black, paint in white. It doesn't really matter, right? You just paint this the way it makes sense for your scene. And then what I do is when I'm done painting, I'll go back through and I'll kind of just smear it, smudge it, blur it all over again. Okay, now look back at this, the camera view. Now look at the camera view now and see how different this looks, right? From the camera view, it looks soft. The transitions from light to dark are more gradual, right? Things aren't crispy and crunchy, okay? When we look at it through our texture now. So we can jump back into our texture and then take a look at this now, right? We can see we've got this rock, cracked earth texture up here, and it gradually blends into this sand gravelly texture here, and it kind of does this throughout the terrain, right? That's basically it, right? That's the whole magic of how I blend my terrain textures, okay? If you did this with a hand-painted image texture, it would basically be the same thing, except you'd be painting on an image that you would then save, but it would still apply the same way. And I'll make another video on that technique because it's relative to this one. It's slightly different, but I'm going to keep this video about the Vertex, option. Okay, let's save it. So that's basically it. Now check this out. There's one last thing that you want to do to really sell the terrain. Look at these rocks. If I zoom in here, all the rocks look flat. Okay, so look, we have to work with displacement. So let's go ahead and get that going. So let me jump out of this render. Let's look back at our textures. Both of our textures came with a displacement map. Okay, there it is. Now, if I let's just take this top one here for a second, and we're going to plug that into our material output displacement. We have to do that via the displacement node. So I'll drag this out, add a displacement. We want the height. Okay, so I'll plug that in, and I'll plug this one in right to that displacement. Okay, so we can see it's done something to our plane right here, right? It's added some displacement. Okay, but our rocks still look pretty flat. Okay, so let me see what happens if I plug in the bottom or the displacement from the bottom texture. Okay, you can see that it was a little bit more pronounced. It's made some waves here. It doesn't really look right. Right, so we need to work with this a little bit. So this is what we're going to do. First thing, we're going to keep this displacement here. We're going to mix our two displacement maps. Okay, they're both PNGs in this particular case. Okay, we're going to do it the same way we merged the principled BSDFs. So if you Control-Shift, right-click, drag between them, it'll automatically mix them together with the appropriate node, which in this case is a mixed color node. Okay, now I'm fairly certain that it is a right-click. I'm using a tablet, so I don't have left and right. My buttons are top and bottom, but I'm pretty sure it's a right click. If not, do it with a left. Either way, it'll work. If you don't want to use Node Wrangler, then what you're going to use is just Shift A and look for a mix color node. It's the same thing, okay? And then you're just going to connect them both to the A and B sockets, okay? In my case, I'm going to do it the way I like to do it and then mix those together. So what I've done here is I've mixed both of these displacement maps. Okay, if I look at one of them just so you can see it's just a grayscale image, right? There's the top one and then there's the bottom one. Okay, I've just mixed those together and put them together like so. Now, just like before, the factor is deciding, right, which one you're looking at. So if I go to 0, you're looking at one. If I go to 1, you're looking at the other. But I'm going to use the exact same mask that I did for the color I'm going to use for this. So I'm going to plug this directly into the factor here. Now when I look at this, okay, it's going to have the exact same mask as the top one. Right? Now I'll plug this into the height for my displacement here. And if I look at this, magical. Let's look at the main mix shader. Okay, so we're mixing them together, but it's still wrong. Okay, the scale is much too big. So let's bring this down to 0.1. Okay, it doesn't look all crazy and chunky right now. Okay, but we're still not getting this really great result. We're getting some displacement. We can see that our plane has been displaced slightly. In fact, our dude is floating now. Our displacement has literally lowered this part of the texture. Now we can fix that just by adjusting the mid-level. So let's try 0.4. That's a little bit better. Let's try 0.3. Still, let's try 0.25. That's pretty good. Okay, so we fixed that. Our dude isn't floating anymore. If we do a quick render, we can see here that it's looking better, right? We can see some displacement, but it's not quite, we're not quite getting the detail out of the rocks. There's one more thing we need to do, and that'll be the secret sauce of the whole operation. Let's check that out. Okay, so here's what we need to do for the last step, okay? First things first, go in and add a subdivision modifier to your plane, okay? In this case, I just did Control-2 to give it a viewport levels of 2, okay? We're gonna go in to our render engine settings here, and right underneath cycles, supported, we're gonna change supported to experimental. Right? We can already start to see a difference here. Back in our subdivision modifier, you can see adaptive subdivision is turned on. If it wasn't, okay, you're going to still see levels, viewport, render, etc. Just turn on or click this little adaptive subdivision. Okay. Now, look what's happening to our rocks now. If we zoom in a lot, we're going to see like this, stretching in the texture. And there's things we can do about that. But for right now, we're going to be pretty far away from it, at least at this distance. That's pretty much it. Okay, now I'll render this again. Okay, so now check it out. Now we can actually see the rocks. They're popping up now, right? The ground looks like it's got texture to it now, right? It's not flat. It's a little too much, okay? But we're on the right track. So let me just open up slot 2 so we can compare this. I'm going to bump the scale down a little bit. It's a little bit too high, I think. I'm going to go to like 0.03. That looks pretty good. Maybe a bit more, maybe 0.05. Okay, and then let's render again. And what you're going to want to do here is just depending on the textures that you're using, just kind of go back and forth, adjust the scale as needed, right? Different textures are gonna look, different ways. Different displacement maps are going to respond, their own way. But here we go. And now I've got this much more believable terrain, and that's all it is. That's all I do. That's it. That's the whole process. I hope that was helpful. If it was, and you like the videos I'm making, please consider liking and subscribing. If you'd like to support me so I can keep making these, please consider buying me a coffee. Link below. Hope you have a good one. See you in the next video. Bye.